Pop Shield, a long-form discussion podcast about musical topics both past and present. I'm Gabe, and I'm joined as always by Dan.
Hello.
And Darin.
Hello.
You know, I like to start each episode by asking you guys what you've been listening to lately.
Yeah, I've been listening to album you told me about, Gabe, actually, the Caretaker. Oh, shit, what was the name of that? It just left me. Everywhere at the End of Time or something?
Yes.
Yeah, brain fart. It's like 6-disc or 6 hour long, 6 hours of like tracing dementia through like disintegrating loops of old 78s and stuff.
Yeah,
you know, right up my alley. It's pretty it's pretty interesting. So thank you for that recommendation.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I was sick for most of the time that we were supposed to be listening, so I was mostly just focusing on Scott Walker. But I did want to share with you guys that today, April 10th, which is when we're recording, is actually the anniversary of Paul McCartney announcing the breakup of the Beatles.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, we should have done something.
Well, next year will be 50 years since the Beatles broke up, so we can do something then, right?
Okay. All right.
Nice.
Well, I wanted to use this space to tell you guys about a little field trip. I went and saw Jason and Mitski at the Egyptian Room in the old National Center at Indianapolis, April 2nd. Kind of a weird venue. It was like, I sent you guys a picture. It looked like a giant ancient Mew card or something.
It really did.
Kind of like kitschy Egyptian. But, anyway, we reviewed on our previous podcast the Jason record, the last Jason record, and I really loved it. The show, though, I got to say, she strikes me as somebody who has not really played live a lot. I don't know if that's true, but, you get this vibe of her being a sort of like a bedroom producer, extraordinaire kind of genius person. And she was, I don't know, just like a little shy and reserved, and there wasn't all the layering and stuff. And, it was fine, but a little underwhelmed. Mitski, though, I mean, really, really delivered. It was kind of unlike anything I'd ever seen before, because she brings out this table and she's doing this kind of, on her last album, this kind of vibe of like, I don't know, sexually repressed, but seductive, but dead inside housewife or something routine. And so she's kind of like sprawling out on the table, sometimes climbing on the table, sometimes getting like really erotic on the table. Sounds like it's gonna, run out of steam pretty quickly, but she'll like flip the table over and use it as a prop in different ways. And it was highly choreographed. And I really love her last album, and they are quite pop and sort of like a self-aware, almost Lana Del Rey kind of style. And it just really worked. And it weirdly felt like, how sometimes you wonder, like, is Pitchfork famous, like really famous, because she got album of the year last year, but she really felt like a bona fide pop star. It felt like weird to be in a regular sized kind of like indie rock venue watching a show that was like, obviously not as complex, but like a Beyonce or a Lady Gaga, like that kind of star power almost. Now, Darin, you saw her before, right? Did she do anything like this?
No, that's why I was going to mention, like, I saw your clips, and I just thought it was so wild, because when I saw her, she had a guitar the entire time. I mean, she was like, just a guitarist, guitar singer, leading the band or whatever. And then when I saw your clips and she didn't have an instrument in her hands, I was kind of taken aback. Like, so the entire show was like that?
Yeah, it sort of had this arc to it where by the end, she brought out like an acoustic guitar and did basically two and a half songs really that were like really mellow and sort of like this closing note before the band like rejoined and sort of crescendoed at the end. But that felt, almost like an epilogue to this, sort of thing where she's like sexually repressed and really stiff, and then gets like more and more, I don't know, flamboyant or like acting out in some sort of, performance art kind of way. So it sounds like she just totally reinvented herself for this new album, which is really kind of impressive. But I got to say, it was like quite an experience to see, and I would highly, highly recommend it. Although who knows if she'll go right back to just being a regular indie rocker. Okay, with that, we should jump into today's topic. On March 22nd, as I'm sure everybody knows, Scott Walker passed away at the age of 76, and the outpouring of tributes and recollections from fans, music publications, and musicians alike made Darin and me feel pretty ashamed that we had never listened to him before. I'm actually still embarrassed saying this. Unlike us, though, Dan is a longtime fan, so he assigned us 2 albums, Scott 2 from 1968 and Tilt from 1995, that would give us a sense of Scott Walker's incredible transformation from 60s teen pop star to avant-garde icon, and hopefully convert us to fellow obsessives. We're going to dive deep into these 2 records, but also discuss Walker's career arc, surrounding mythology, and cult figure status as a whole, and basically find out what it takes to get into one of the most puzzling and eventually uncompromising artists in pop music history. So let's start with you, Dan. When did you discover, and get into Scott Walker?
Yeah, I'm apparently the only patrician on this podcast. I honestly, I don't really remember exactly like how I did, but I know it was Bish Bosh, which I think is from 2012, if I remember right.
I think so.
I probably either just, read something online or, read the Pitchfork review or something, and I listened to it, and it's just this very scary man singing with weird noises in the background, and that is right up Dan's alley. So I was pretty hooked very soon, after that. So I got into Bish Bosh, and then I went backwards, Tilt, Drift, and then I eventually listened to the older records after that. I want to kind of return to that throughout this discussion, because I think that's pretty, maybe that's normal now, but I don't know. That seems pretty odd to start, there. Would you say that before these weeks, though, these last 2 weeks, that you considered yourself like a big fan of those early albums as well? Yeah. I mean, I have, like the early ones almost as much as the later ones. I don't want to give too much away since we're going to talk about them. But yeah, it's almost like it's 2 separate artists to me a little bit. But yeah, I love those old records in like a weird sort of singer, Baccarat kind of thing way, but, and then the later ones, obviously, super experimental and all that stuff. But, I strangely do love, both periods.
Interesting. So Darin, I mean, had you heard Scott Walker's name? Have you heard about all this, mythos, or what did you know going in?
So I had known Scott Walker's name, and I was familiar with the Scott 1, 2, 3, and 4 records, probably from just browsing All Music or something like that, just kind of coming across the name and then checking out some of those albums. And I know at some point I probably downloaded a couple of them, planning to listen to them eventually, just never really did. But I didn't know anything about this sort of second half of his career. I was only familiar with those albums from the 60s and 70s.
Wow. Yeah, I feel like I've always known his name, and at some point I did try to listen to, I think, the first Scott 1, and probably just made it a couple songs in, and I was just like, what, this is not for me. What is this, Sinatra trash? But really didn't get it, and then I was just kind of aware that he became really insanely experimental later on. I guess I must have put on the record he did with Sun a couple years ago.
Soused.
When it came out. Yeah, Soused. I like Sun, but I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but that voice, threw me for a loop. I was like, wow, I really I don't remember liking it, but I don't, now I hate it. So that was kind of as much as I knew, but it still always felt like one of those things where this is a big, something I need to get over, especially as I've gotten older, and, especially after finding out that he died, I was like, God damn, I really need to get around to listening to Scott Walker. So I was excited to do this. We'll go chronologically, unlike Dan, and start with Scott 2. I want to know why you assigned us this album, especially out of those 4 that are all pretty beloved, I guess.
Yeah, Scott 1 is honestly my favorite of these 4 early records, but that one, it's pretty much all covers, and Scott 2 is the first one where he's it's a mix. It's got the Brel songs, some of this weird, I think there's a Bacharach song, but then he also writes a couple. So it's like a good mix of that, because Scott 4 is mostly all that, and Scott 4 is a little weird. It's still very less weird than Tilt or anything, but it's you can sort of see the arc more. Scott 2 is like we're starting to get there a little bit, but we're not quite there. It's still very separate. And I think it's just super interesting how much he's changed, and I think that gives you like a deeper appreciation of his experimentation to like see where he came from.
Yeah. I think that this is a good one, and actually over the last 2 weeks I ended up kind of, I had this ambition to listen to like his entire discography over the course of these 2 weeks. I didn't quite get there, but I did dabble at least in all of these Scott records, and this one there's certainly a couple originals which are fantastic from Scott 1, but this one is almost kind of divided in like perfect threes, of his songs, Brel songs. We'll talk about all this, and others you might categorize them as, but I think it's worth going over just a little bit of background. I'm sure everybody knows, but the idea that he starts like even in as early as the late 50s as like really this teen pop singer. I'm not sure how entirely successful he was, but it's like he was sort of being positioned as in this, I don't know, Justin Bieber of the 50s kind of way. And then he joins up with 2 people who are not his brothers and not named Walker, and neither is he, but they become the Walker brothers, and they become a fairly successful, especially in the UK, kind of like a pop, but sort of heavily orchestrated, sort of dramatic pop group. And then he launches a hugely successful solo career, at least initially. And when I say hugely successful, I think he had a few crossover hits here, but in the UK, I think he's much more widely known, really identified with the 60s, the swingin' 60s of London, even though he's not that swingin'. Darin, were you, in familiar with any of this? Or like, I'm really interested in, what was your approach? Were you just like, I'm going to go in blind and start listening to Scott 2, or did you know a little bit about this early period?
No, I really didn't. I kind of went in fairly blind, a little bit of reading of, I think Pitchfork did a review of like what the four records plus another one, like in a box set release. And, in it talks about how, he sort of bucked the psychedelic tradition of the 60s, you know what I mean? So that was sort of something that I had in mind when I was listening to this. And then I guess his approach was really to market himself towarst, Pitchfork literally said like housewives and elderly people, right? So, that for some reason actually seemed really interesting to me. And maybe it's just because you're listening to somebody from the 60s who no longer, obviously, housewives and elderly people of today are listening to. So it's just kind of a weird thing to listen to somebody who, is considered a cult icon, right? And somebody who is from the 60s, but is not like all about the psychedelics and all this kind of stuff. So that was pretty much it, though. Like I didn't really do a whole lot of research. I just started listening.
Yeah, it's really, really weird. And this is like one of those things that I think is just always true of history. This came out in, I think, March of 1968, and it, in London, in the UK rather, went number 1 and stayed there for quite a long time. And this is, like the height of the 60s, like the hippie era, the Woodstock era, and it doesn't seem to fit with the narrative we have of the time that this is the number 1 album for so long. But, in trying to figure that out, maybe we should try to describe the sound. Dan, how would you describe the sound of this record?
If you just look at it straight, it's like a weird, Baroque pop kind of. I don't know if lounge singer is the right word. Like, honestly, this is like style of music, Bacharach, Humperdinck. Like, those are all people, like, you know their name, but like, you know, I don't think I know any of those songs. You know, it's as people of our age, it's sort of a gap of our knowledge in music. Because even like my grandparents didn't even listen to, you know, that kind of stuff. So it's like, you know, it's got this it's like something that you're like familiar enough with the sound of it, you know, from movies and TV and just,
Sinatra and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. This like, you know, crooning, storytelling kind of, you know, song, like very like well pronounced, like the you know, old people always fucking complain when they like I can't understand what he's saying, and you know, like all these singers, they like every word is like you can
belt
hear
it out.
yeah, exactly. And you know, that's what we get here. But I think the reason I like it is there's like, and maybe it's because, you know, I heard these after hearing what was to come, but there's like there's a strangeness like lurking around the corner during this. You know, it's like when you listen to a Sinatra, and I'm gonna have my Italian American card revoked for saying this, but he fucking sucks. And
wow,
you know, it's like it's music for your grandparents. But this, you know, there's just like, it's music for your grandparents, but like, it's a little weird. It's like, it is a little creepy, like, ness. I don't know if it's his voice or what, but we can dig more into that.
Yeah. If I just could add, like, you know, one of the first images that come to my mind when I listen to this, and this kind of happens when you hear like strings from the 60s, I think of like going into like a Goodwill, you know, and like looking through vinyl, and where you see just like tons and tons of these like sort of nameless, forgotten, you know, artists and stuff. That's exactly what this like initially sounded like to me.
Exactly.
Yeah, I felt so too. And again, I can't get over the fact that it's, you know, 1968, but it's got that, it really has that like kind of early 60s Phil Spector wall of sound vibe to it. It's got that like big, vibrant strings and brass and stuff. And, you know, there's also like kind of especially early in the first half of the record, there's like usually a mixed in is like something akin to like rock, you know, drum and bass is kind of like underneath the orchestration, which does give it like kind of a cool 60s aesthetic, late 60s aesthetic. But you know, I think we'll have to tear down individual songs, I think, to talk about what they sound like. But you're right that the initial impression you get is something very antiquated. How did you do, Darin, with his voice? To me, it's something that takes a little getting used to.
You know, I didn't find it too difficult. You know, obviously, when we get to the next record, I'll have something else to say. But you know, I think that he kind of fits right into this sort of, you know, almost like lounge singer. You know, you don't like Sinatra, but that sort of realm of like real masculine, you know, I'm wearing a suit and a tie when I sing type of voice. You know what I mean? And I think he honestly, I like his voice. I think he's a very good singer on this record in particular.
Yeah, I came to like it, but it's a little jarring because it's like this, you know, baritone. It's really soaring and like, you know, lush, but, you know, he does this like vibrato thing like crazy, you know? It's called almost...
That's a good singer who do that. You know, that's a skill, Gabe.
It is, but it's like almost ridiculous at points where he's just like, you know, and I came to really love the aesthetic, like the sound of the record, because it's got this like strange classicness to it, like this strange kind of what you were getting at, Dan, which I think we'll dive into more. But I think the only way to really dive into it is to divide it up, like I was saying earlier, because we've got really equal thirds. His originals, this standard kind of like middle of the road for elderly people and housewives kind of stuff, and then Jacques Brel covers. So let's start with the standard stuff, okay? We've got a couple songs here that are, in fact, we've got a Burt Bacharach song, but we've also got, you know, basically Best of Both Worlds. Black Sheep Boy is kind of like this twangy country thing. It was probably a hit for numerous people. Wait Until Dark is like the theme song that was composed for some like Audrey Hepburn movie or something. The last song, Come Next Spring, is like the most Sinatra thing here, I think. What do you guys make of these tracks? Do you enjoy them?
I do. I think some of them are sort of the weaker points of the record, but I do like them. And again, I really wish I could have heard like these records before hearing, what was to come, because I wonder if I like would have liked it, or if I'm just like, I can't tell if like what I like about it is that it's like this very weird guy singing these very unweird songs. Like one of them's Henry Mancini. Like I've never heard that person, but I've spent a lot of time at Goodwill, and that's a name that comes up quite a bit. Yeah, so it's like, and I think, I don't know, I feel like almost if I did hear this record first, I would still sort of think there's this weirdness, because his voice is like very strange. It's like this crazy baritone, like I don't know, like almost Dracula sings you some songs. Like my wife hates Scott and she always compares it to Shoo Shoo. Like he sounds like the guy from Shoo Shoo, Jamie. And stuff. So like I feel like there is this weirdness, and that's what I like about the songs that are the middle of the road ones. Is it's like, you've got this guy who's not middle of the road, like elevating these low brow kind of things. I don't know if that's just me like projecting, because I know.
I think that's the question.
Though.
That's really the big issue, is like, which I want to return to and spend more time on, but like, what would these sound like if we didn't know where he was going? I mean, Darin, what do you think? Do you think that you would find, especially those songs that I just mentioned, like anything interesting about them if you didn't kind of know where he's heading?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you this. I listened to Scott too before ever listening to Tilt, so I had no idea. I had no idea, no frame of reference, no idea how the spectrum was going to stretch. You know what I mean, for him. Right. So I thought the lead song Jackie kind of already set you off in a way where I was like, okay, this is already a little bit weird, like. The music sounds normal, but this guy saying "stupid ass" in such a dramatic way is kind of just
cute in a stupid ass way.
Right. I was like, all right, this is interesting. The next two songs, like you mentioned, Gabe, are very standard sounding, and I like them. I mean, I think Black Sheep Boy is a great song. For some reason, I knew that song, and I just could not figure out which cover it was that I had heard. But I just knew the song. But then, like, the album, and I know we'll talk a little bit about the pacing, I imagine, but like, it seems to move at a nice enough pace where I don't feel like I'm getting bored of these sort of pop standards. He seems to add little bits of like just weirdness. Obviously that was it, the Amorous Humphrey plug, his first original on the record, kind of is already setting a new tone. You know what I mean? That like I feel like it's okay. I feel like he earns the right to have some of these weird pop standards thrown in there as well.
Okay, that's kind of interesting. So the idea that these taken as a whole, because basically I'm questioning Dan. Like, is it real? Like, is it real that there's anything weird about these songs, or is it just what he knows? But I can kind of buy what you're saying, that they're sitting amongst some pretty strange songs, which does kind of force you to listen to them in a maybe, different angle than you would if they were on a Goodwill kind of record.
Right.
I find that, really, I think that they are kind of unremarkable, but you're kind of persuading me otherwise a little bit here, but they're like fine songs sometimes. I really don't care much for like Wait Until Dark, or although that little bell thing is kind of nice, or like Come Next Spring is just like totally whatever, but Windows of the World as well. I find that they sound quite uninspired, and I'm actually really curious why he's doing this, because it seems like he likes these songs, at least at this point in his life, or is it just total record label pressure? But like, even the orchestration of these songs is not that interesting. right? So we can just jump all over the place, but if we think about his originals, Plastic Palace People, I think is basically a masterpiece. And, we can come back to it and dive into it in more detail, but it's like one of the sections in that song is like very impressionistic. It sounds like Ravel or something, where, and he's singing about, like this kid, like kind of, it's like that movie, The Red Balloon, like this kid, like sort of, I don't know, floating, chasing this balloon and using it to float away or something like that. And the music is just so, the orchestration is like incredible, and it just really adds like compliments to the lyrical subject matter. And having watched, we'll talk about this too, that documentary, I know he was like really interested in sort of telling his composers and stuff, the people who are arranging things for him, like, oh, I want this to sound like, people like Ravel or Debussy or whatever. It feels like on Best of Both Worlds or Windows of the World, he's just like, whatever, whatever Burt Bacharach would have done, just do that. Do you feel like that at all?
Yeah, I agree. I think Scott Walker himself is really the only thing that saves these songs or makes them interesting. If you removed him and put in, I don't know, Sinatra or somebody like that, boy, it would lose a lot of identity, I think. I think he manages to, add a personality to the song. And, like, we kind of already talked about having him next to some of these other, like, weird songs, and his originals takes that personality out of his weird songs and kind of applies it to these standards in a way that I think at least gives it something more interesting to listen to. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but it's weird, right? That he didn't, like,
try to make those songs weird.
Cared. Yeah, like he didn't care to be like, can we make that like orchestration a little more dense? Can we add like a little, atonality just in this little part or something? Maybe the label just wouldn't let him. But you kind of see what I'm saying, Dan?
I think it's that. I think it's that the label, he could sneak a couple things by, Plastic Palace People and stuff. But I think, at this time period, and the record preceding this like did well in the charts and stuff, but it's not like he doesn't have like the free reign like someone like the Beatles got, at a certain point, because even the Beatles had to wait 5 records or whatever before they even got it. So I think like he, some of this stuff does kind of feel like, yeah, the label's probably like, oh, you should do a Bacharach, a Mancini's hot. Because I agree with you, Wait Until Dark is the worst song on this record.
Yeah,
but I think it, and I don't know for sure because he was such a reclusive person and didn't do a ton of interviews or anything. But it seems like the Brel songs and his own like really seem like he's feeling it now. These are the ones he's wanting to do, and then the rest are like, yeah, I'm sure he probably like put some effort into. He wouldn't want to like release something that just sounded like shit, but. Probably a little, I would guess that he put a little less effort into those, perhaps,
Yeah. They're pleasant, but like, would you listen if there was an album that was like from Scott 1 and 2, just the middle of the road type songs?
Oh, yeah. No, it would be one of those things, like Darin said, that you find in Goodwill. Yeah, it would be maybe slightly better, but yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah.
Okay, all right.
So, just one last thing. So, and Dan, help me out here, because in the Pitchfork article I read, I sort of, it seemed to imply that he cared about his placement on the charts, right? Like he wanted to make sure that he was up there. So do you think that has anything to do with this too?
He sort of mentioned that in the documentary, 30th Century Man. Like he talked about it because Scott 4 like basically doesn't do well, and that's the first one that he sort of has like full reign on. And while it's still sort of a standard type things, it's getting a little weird. And that record didn't chart for very long. Fell off and got deleted from catalog and everything like very quickly. And he talks about it in the movie, like if that had not happened, he would have got to Tilt and Climate of Hunter and stuff quicker. And the reason he like had to, there's all these like in between records that he refuses to have reissued and stuff, and they're like super hard to find. And like he basically says like he had to do those to have a recording contract, And so I think that he I mean, it's easy to say like he cared about the charts because he knew that would give him the freedom, and maybe that's some projecting of knowing the future. But I feel like he understood that to get what he wanted, you have to, especially in the 60s when you couldn't just make a record in your bedroom, you had to kind of play the game to get there.
Yeah. We'll get to that, man. But it does kind of seem like his stuff from the 70s, this kind of dark period, is what it would have been like if he was doing what I just mentioned, like just the middle of the road stuff.
Yeah.
And it seems like to me like just he's very private, obviously, and who knows, but it seems to me like he's got some like alcohol issues maybe in that period, he says, but also there's some kind of like Scott 4 being not well received, like really hurt him in kind of like a Weezer Pinkerton sort of way. And he just like almost gave up on chasing his artistic vision, which kind of made me think, well, I don't know, not to jump the gun, but it makes me wonder, like, what if other artists did what Scott Walker did? Like, what if Rivers Cuomo like went full Scott Walker, after this dark period that we discussed a few episodes ago, and he just like puts out his tilt, in a couple of years. Oh my God. But anyway, let's talk about on Scott 2, the Jacques Brel songs. Now, Darin, are you familiar with Jacques Brel at all?
I'm not.
So he's like this, he's really Belgian, but, famous in France, sang in French, singer from like the 50s and then early to mid 60s. I think he carried on a little bit longer, but he's sort of identified with that period. And he's just kind of this, like the idea you get from Jackie. He's like this very theatrical, dramatic singer. His songs often have like sort of a darkness to them, but like sort of a humorous twist usually. I think he's like really fantastic. And I up until this week, knew him a lot better than Scott Walker. Are you a fan, Dan, of Jacques Brel?
Yeah, I not like huge, like I'm aware of him and those like two big famous records like I have and I know and stuff. But I was a bigger, I know these songs more from Scott than I do from Brel.
Yeah.
So sort
it
of
was fun to actually like learn what the lyrics.
Yeah. I thought that too.
But okay, so we've got Jackie, which starts the record. We've got Next, which is weird. We'll talk about, and we've got The Girls and the Dogs, which is also pretty weird. What did you make of these songs, Darin?
So yeah, I knew that those songs in particular were, I guess, from that Jacques Brel. I just didn't really, obviously they kind of share a similar sound, like you just mentioned. But I like them. I thought they were interesting songs. I felt like they fit kind of into like what Scott Walker was trying to do. You know what I mean? And almost gave him an opportunity to just be weird on like, a very like fast-paced like pop song, you know what I mean? Almost to the point where I was almost wondering to myself, like, did he like change like lyrics, like on like the song Next really feels like he wrote that song. It almost seems like to me, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it seems like Brel is like this huge just muse for Walker, and not even just in this period, but for like his entire life, because it's like Brel it's like that sort of off-kilter like perversity or something, and also these kind of strange character studies that we'll talk about in Tilt, but particularly a song like Next is just incredible, right? It's like telling the story of, I don't know, some guy who's basically like raped in the army or something repeatedly, right. And he's like it's like kind of soiled his idea of sexuality forever or something like that. And what's amazing is that it's done like in this almost theatrical, cartoonish way. And this is the thing that I love so much about these songs, is that on those middle of the road tracks, you've got kind of sappy, kitschy like strings, honestly, and then on these tracks it's like that, but it's turned up to 11 and the song totally needs it. You know what I mean, Dan?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's part of like where I said earlier, like that weirdness creeps in, like the strings are turned up to 11, it's like a little more than that normal, grandma, grandpa kind of lounge thing, like it's distorted a little bit. And then, like the lyrics of Next is like, if you heard your grandparents listening to that,
Right.
it'd be fairly strange. But I think Next is maybe the best song on this record. Just the story is like crazy. And, he's talking about gonorrhea. He's using, epitaphs against homosexuals. It's a crazy song. It's really not.
It is crazy.
When you put this on, Jackie's like a little bit like that, but not quite as much. But best of both worlds. You're not expecting Next.
Right.
Like everything that comes before you're not expecting. What this song is, and I think that's the kind of song that can sell people on early Walker to show you that it is like a little different, even though he didn't write it. Still, he had the wherewithal to pick it out.
I mean, he really inhabits it. I think.
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, if I didn't know and I didn't like look at the, if I just had this record and I didn't read anything about it, I would assume he wrote that song. He really embodies it so well that it doesn't seem like a cover.
Yeah. So I mean, basically, we should mention. Not sure if you're aware, Darin, but on Scott 1, 2, and 3, he covers at least three Brel songs each. To the point where sometime in the 90s or something, they released like a compilation of all of his Brel. It's called like Scott Walker Sings Jacques Brel or something. So based on your limited knowledge, Darin, what do you think draws him to Jacques Brel?
I mean, I'm not sure. Like, I think you guys really put it together very well that like he kind of just owns those songs in a really strange way. Like it, I think even if I listened to Jacques Brel, I'd probably have a hard time feeling like this was the original versus, Scott Walker. But I feel like he might have found in Jacques Brel like a vehicle towards his sort of weird take on pop music. You know what I mean? Because I mean, the bottom line is, even if it's a cover of a French pop song in English, in the way he sings it, it's just it's unconventional. You know what I mean? Like I can't imagine your standard 60s pop singer singing a song like that. You know what I mean? But like somebody like Scott Walker, and forget the what happens with Tilt and stuff. Like again, for me, I didn't even know, but I knew that those three songs were weird, and I was like, okay, I think I get it. This guy, the reason why I'm actually caring to listen to him, the reason why he's not like a forgotten name, is because of songs like this, songs like Next, right? He's adding a twist. I know it sounds like sort of cliche. It's like, oh well, you just you've got your standard pop singer, but this guy's just a little weird. He's just doing it a little bit differently, and now he's a cult icon, whatever. Like, again, my approach coming in was like, why do we care about Scott Walker? Why am I listening to Scott Walker when I hear this music? It sure doesn't sound like anything that is original or worthy of being listened to. But Scott Walker, the vocalist, his approach, the way he sings these songs, it's just different. It's different enough to, I think, warrant, listening to this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah. And I think like, when I've said that like sort of the orchestration is cranked up to 11, it kind of reminds me, I know they're Jacques Brel songs, but it reminds me of like Serge Gainsbourg, another French artist, maybe a little bit later than Brel, but it's a similar vibe of like, we're going to make it so schmaltzy that it like makes you feel uncomfortable a little bit or something. I mean, there's kind of like that cool twist to those songs. But I think for a lot of people, for most people maybe, the selling point here are the originals by Scott Walker, which include the Amorous Humphrey Plug, really, really odd name. Really, that feels like 1968 to me.
Yes. The
Girls from the Streets, Plastic Palace People, and The Bridge. Now, for me, it's hard for me to say that these are the best songs on the album because I do love the Brel one so much. But like I mentioned before, I mean, Plastic Palace People, it would be like a standout track on Sgt. Pepper's.
Yes.
And I'm not even joking.
Yes.
it's stunning. I mean, it moves like it's just incredible that like that's sitting beside, something like Wait Until Dark, because it's got like 3 different sections. It's got this like really strange vocal effect, but it moves through this like, the lyrics are on a like much higher level than almost anything else on the record. And just like this song structure that's almost like telling 2 stories or something. You've got this like kind of Icarus situation with this kid in this red balloon, but then you've got like some person named Alice, and it's a little bit like vague and ambiguous, but the images are really, really incredible. And, the way that it's almost like from the boys' perspective, you've got this like glistening, like Ravel style, thing going on, these strings, and then like Alice's perspective is this more like kind of, poppy, like walking the streets of London kind of a vibe, but it's got this like self-awareness that just, I don't know, it makes me think of like Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, not to name drop too much. I'm going to do that a lot on Tilt, but it's like ordinary, but there's something like sort of strange underneath it. Do you love the song as much as me, Dan?
You're going to be shocked, I think, but this song is not that great. I really don't. Wow. Yeah, I really don't love it that much. It's that weird, that vocal effect. It sounds, where it sounds all watery and stuff. It just like it.
Why don't you like that?
It just sounds like when I listen to that song, I sort of feel like I can see like. I can sort of like in it like a crystal ball. I can sort of see Tilt coming. But it's like it's not fully formed yet, and it's just like, I don't know, it's like a little misstepish. Like that vocal effect just doesn't like, it just seems like a little out of place. The story is the storytelling in it is cool, and all that is nice. It just like, I don't know, all the little pieces like. It's interesting to me, and then I can see a little bit of what's to come from it, but it's not fully formed yet. We're not there, and it's kind of I really honestly don't love that song very much at all.
Wow, are you on my side, Darin?
I pretty much am. I don't consider it my favorite song on the record, but it's definitely a standout. Probably top 3, I would say. And it's interesting how, like I had mentioned at the top, my understanding was that Scott Walker was sort of like bucking the psychedelic trend of the time, but yet this song is as psychedelic as anything that you can think of from the 60s, really. I kind of struggle, and we'll get into this, but like I don't really understand how you could see Tilt from this. I mean, it's definitely different.
See, I think it's like, one thing that I think I just fucking love about this song is it like ends on a verse, which is just so cool to me. I know like we're beyond the 60s, but if you just imagine like the 60s, and you had a song, it's like, what's the structure? Verse, chorus, bridge. Verse, chorus, bridge, verse. It's like a full minute long verse, and then you're just like, and just the way that like glistening Ravel verse goes, you just are like totally left hanging. You're like, are you gonna hit me with another Plastic Palace people or what? And no, it just like robs you of it. And it also has like this nice crescendo, because I think that voice, where his voice is like having that effect, it's totally cool. It reminds me of like the Flaming Lips or something, like Feeling Yourself Disintegrate or something, because it's like the voice is like breaking apart, and you got these like fairly ordinary scenes almost, sometimes kind of fantastical, but then it's just like when that comes in and the music changes, it's like this darkness underneath these everyday scenes and these dreamy scenes. And we'll get to it, but it really reminds me of Tilt, because Tilt is like it's very like operatic, where the song changes based on like the emotion of the narrator or something. It crescendos like a thematic points, and to me this song just nails that, but not to Dan. What about the other originals? How did are any of those other originals your favorite song by chance, Darin?
No, I think of the originals, Plastic Palace People is my favorite, but I was a big fan of the Brel songs. I really liked his cover of Black Sheep Boy as well. Those are kind of among my favorite songs. Kind of, it's interesting. Like have favorites from like all three of these sort of
groups,
categories that you're. Yeah.
What about you, Dan? What, since you just don't like Plastic Palace People for some reason, what of his originals do you like?
I don't dislike it. It's just I don't like it as I don't like it as much as I should. I don't know.
Impressed.
Yeah, I'm just not that impressed. I don't know. I like the Amorous Humphrey plug a bit. I think of the originals, I'd probably pick that one. But really, on this record, the Brel songs are what really sells it for me. I like the Brel songs much more than anything else.
Yeah, I'm just I don't know. I'm really kind of in awe. I'm just like sort of looking and just picking like a random like just like the bridge, okay, which is the second to last song. It's his last original on the record. If you just like read any of the lyrics, like, I've watched her from the riverbanks. I knew her when she danced with dreams. White doves were there to dress her hair, and so was Madeleine. At night, the people's faces danced like pearls colliding on the breast of Fat Marie, whose thunder laugh was just a thread from crying. It's like, what are you even doing singing Burt fucking Bacharach? like you can write shit like that. I mean, it just feels like so... some people might think it's like sometimes a little like overdone, but it's just like when he does these originals, I am kind of like in awe at his talent. And like, thank God he didn't just quit in the 70s, because it's like, it almost like just blows. I mean, I love the Brel stuff. The Brel stuff is so much fun, but it like just almost ruins the middle of the road songs for me, because I'm like, damn, if he just would write all those. In fact, I'm tempted to just make like my own album out of like, basically Scott 1 and 2, the opposite of what I said before, where it's like just his originals, because I mean, I don't know. It's a shame that there's like so little here, but it's just enough to make you feel like, wow, this guy is special. Another thing I wanted to ask about though is this sort of like image that he's presenting. It's kind of interesting because he's like, we talk about him like he's this, incredible artist, which I think he is, but he's like this uncompromising artist. He's, even though he might have compromised, it seems early in his career, obviously, that he's like this recluse, that he's like just really pure art, whatever. But early on, he's got this like brand. It's like this moody crooner. He's always wearing sunglasses and like wearing a scarf. He's like a recluse and hating fame, but he's like publishing that, the way that like Nirvana kind of branded that later on, that's like part of Kurt's mythos. There's like rumors. I mean, who knows if this is true, that he's like spent some time in 1968 retreating to a monastery to study Gregorian chant. I mean, it's so fucking ridiculous. It's like Jim Morrison levels of self-mythologizing, I mean, how does that affect your listening experience, Darin?
I don't know. It's really weird because like you're saying he was a recluse and hating fame, but then I'm reading other things about him, basically wanting to be on the charts and then being disappointed when he's not,
and wanting to be a sex symbol,
yeah. So it's like all over the place, which I mean, in some ways this record is a little all over the place. I mean, we in a single record we have like 3 categories or 3 groupings of songs. I think that they are paired pretty well together, though. I think it flows fairly well, where you're not like, you're not feeling like there's too much of one group represented at the same time. Because honestly, I thought the pacing of the album was fine. I'd never really felt like I was ready to move on or get on with it or anything like that. The Brel songs I think are placed in really good places. I think Plastic Palace People being kind of like right there in the middle. Was good, but yeah, it is strange, and I feel like it's always hard, like looking back at an album and an artist from the 60s and trying to understand the world that they were living in, outside of the music. It's a little jarring, but I don't know, it didn't really negatively impact my listening experience.
Another thing is, later on, when he starts writing his own stuff, it like literally takes like 10 years between every record for him to write, an hour's worth of music. So maybe that's part of like why he, did these middle of the road things, because, in the 60s, especially at this point, when he's not like, it doesn't have this like great artistic license with a label and everything. They're not going to let him take 10 years to release a record. Right. Back then, before the internet and everything, like if you couldn't walk into a record store and pick up the latest, Sinatra record or Beatles or whoever, you're done. You're off. Nobody cares anymore. You were much easier forgotten back then, and I think that might be
it
part
could
of
be,
it.
but he wrote like almost all of 3, and he wrote
That's
like almost
true.
all of 4,
Yeah.
like less than a year later. I don't know. It seems like something happened, but I want to talk about this later for sure. That it seems like his reclusiveness and his like laboring for decades over his music, is also part of his mythology, but like sort of a new sort of mythology that he has in his later career. But to stick to Scott 2, or to kind of wrap up Scott 2, we can obviously like come back to it and compare and contrast and everything. But how did we do? I mean, Darin, do you like this record? Speaking strictly of Scott's early stuff, are you converted? Are you at least interested in checking out the other Scott records?
Very much so, actually. So I would consider this definitely a blunder for not having listened to it before. I really like this record, Scott 2, and I am probably going to check out the other Scotts. But I kind of, Dan, you haven't said a whole lot about Scott 3 and 4. Are those better records or no?
I most people think Scott 4 is like the gem of these, original 4 records. And, it probably is sort of the best one. I honestly, I kind of like all 4 of these records kind of equally. I have like a special affinity for Scott 1, but that's not a common opinion, I don't think. And 3 is sort of the...
it's challenging.
Yeah, it's like sort of the step. If you like 1, 2, and 4, go ahead and hit 3 up. But don't.
Well, I think a lot of people have like a deep affection for it, but it's very moody. It's like all slow strings, and I think people complain that like the last 3 songs in a row are all of the Brel covers, but it's one of these like late night things. I found it difficult, and in fact, even on Scott 2, there was something about like this record that took me like many listens to get into it, and then once I like got it, I started to really dig it. But especially the slow songs toward the latter half are just like you kind of got to listen like several times. I do believe though that Scott 4 is like basically flawless all the way through. I would strongly recommend that one. But
okay.
But I agree. I think I on this 60s stuff for sure, I've been converted. I mean, I hear like, we talked a lot about Jim Morrison, and I think that there's sort of a similarity in a way, Scott Walker and Jim Morrison. But, a lot of the same people, I hear Scott Walker's influence, like people like, Nick Cave, who we talked about before, David Bowie, very much so, especially this early period stuff, specifically. But also like Leonard Cohen, I mean, I know it's around the same time, but very similar vibes. Like Morrissey, it feels like Scott Walker, especially when he's being like a little humorous with the Brel stuff. Morrissey has to have loved that. But, there's just such a like amazing, I don't know, aesthetic, I think, to these early records, and just the sound of them and the sound of his voice. It's like really unforgettable. So I would certainly, in regard to the early stuff, consider myself a convert. Now, I think we kind of talked about this a little bit. If we can hear hints of his later direction, I think it would be better to maybe return to that topic after we dive into Till. But I do want to ask, is it a shame that people now always like, put Tilt and the rest of his legacy on to these early records? Like, should people just listen to them on their own, or are people kind of depriving them of their own sort of worth?
I think it's just it's hard to do that once you've heard something, especially like such a dramatic shift. It's hard to shut that off and just, only, listen to Scott 2 and not think about what comes, like when somebody changes so much, you want to like, you want to find like, well, where did this come from? It's like you almost can't believe like something like that comes like just from left field. So you like dig and you're like, but and I've been doing it this whole time. I can sort of see Tilt a little bit in Plastic Palace People. And I think it's just for me at least, it's very hard to separate those things. Once you already know it. Somebody that just. Like the Beatles, like from the early stuff to the later stuff, like, you can separate those a little easier because it's not, it's a change, but it's not like as drastic of a change as Walker's getting up to here. And so it's just like you gotta try to find where it came from, I think. And so it's really difficult to separate them.
Yeah, what do you think, Darin?
I don't know. Like, I sort of disagree. Like, I already forgive people for not liking early Beatles because they prefer the later Beatles. Like, I forgive people for that. I feel like you should. With Scott Walker, it's far more extreme, and I would be willing to forgive people for either just loving the Tilt era stuff and not caring for the '60s stuff because it's just so vastly different, or vice versa. You know what I mean?
Huh.
Having listened to both of these records now, I still love Scott 2. I feel like I like it for what it is. I just don't. It's really hard. It's hard for me to believe that it's the same person when I turn Tilt on. You know what I mean? It just feels like a totally different. You got to be in a different mood, different. You know what I mean? Like if you were. A night of like listening to Scott Walker's discography to me doesn't include going through these like 60s records and then just let's keep on going right into the, you know what I mean? It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I'm more of the opinion that in the originals, I think it's like completely true that you can hear like the roots of Tilt at least. I think it's like you can't argue it. I already talked about
that's
how
fair.
I hear that in, Plastic Palace People, but, just like anything like the first song on Scott 3, It's Raining Today, like that, like sort of atonal note that's just hanging over the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's going to directly move into Tilt. But, on that note, let's move into Tilt ourselves, but a little bit of background on what kind of goes on in between. We've talked about some of this stuff, but he kind of gets like increasing autonomy with Scott 3 and Scott 4, but they basically flop, especially Scott 4 leads him into these 70s dark ages that you talked about, Dan, where he's really just doing covers. Walker Brothers reunion, it seems like he's doomed to be like on the nostalgia circuit, for the rest of his life. Then there's some, like by some fun twist of fate, gotta love these, it's like the Walker Brothers label is going under, and so they just decide to like put out an album just doing whatever the fuck they want for once. And basically the first 4 songs on Night Flights from 1978 are Scott Walker like, really fully emerging as this like very different thing. It's really incredible, and in my opinion, it's kind of like it's just the direct inspiration for like Bowie's Lodger. A lot of the stuff that him and Eno did together. He disappears until 1984's Climate of the Hunter, which sort of mixes like 80s rock with something that is quite weird and quite a preview of Tilt, in my opinion. And then a recluse again all the way up until 1995 with Tilt. So I guess I wanted to ask just really briefly, Dan, if you have any thoughts on some of this stuff, not Scott 3 and 4, obviously we talked about, but you checked out like Night Flights for the first time. I did as well. And Climate of the Hunter. I actually completely love his tracks on those.
Yeah, Climate of Hunter, I had listened to before. Like, whenever I get into somebody, I always listen to like every record. And it wasn't one that I like ever like really got into or knew much about. But then you had like asked me about it and said that you were really digging it, so I gave it another shot, and I like really kind of came to love that record too. I don't know why I never like it's like a strange 80s sounding rock thing, but then like very weird. So I really came to like that one, and it was kind of nice to discover something in an artist I already liked. And yeah, I that Walker Brothers like reunion record, like I knew about, but I didn't know like the story. I just kind of assumed like Walker Brothers reunion in the 70s, like I'll pass, no thank you. And then I watched that 30th Century Man documentary, and they talked about what you said with the record label closing and all that, and so I gave it a chance, and it's really cool. I definitely want to spend more time with it. I only ran through it like once or twice, but I'm glad to have discovered something new in an artist I liked. It's like getting a free new album.
Yeah. In some ways, I was like a little disappointed to learn that I was wrong in thinking that he like basically vanished after the 60s and like completely reemerged.
That would kind of be a better story.
Yeah, but it's actually really cool that you like get to catch up with him every once in a while, and it's amazing. It sounds like he's developing naturally the whole time. Mm-hmm. It's just he's not releasing anything. So it's like between Climate of Hunter and Tilt, it's like as if he wrote and recorded and then just threw away like 3 albums or something, but, speaking of Tilt, why did you pick this one, Dan?
I mean, Tilt, it's the first of the solidly quote weird one. It's not gotten 100% off the rails, like I think some of the later stuff might a little more than it does here. So I thought it might be like a little easier way to get into it. Not that it's in any way easy. I don't want anybody to misconstrue what I'm saying, but it just seems like kind of the one to get into. It's frequently, it and The Drift are sort of frequently like considered the best of this late period. Yeah. And I think it's just I personally I really love Soused a lot, but I'm also like a huge Sun fan. But I didn't want to talk about that one because I knew we and me would get caught up in all the Sun stuff and talking about Sun instead of Scott. So I wanted to sort of avoid that one. I just Tilt is sort of like a good way to work your way into what happens.
It's kind of like experiencing it the way that most of the world did, because
exactly.
I swear to God, I think most people just don't even know about like Night Flights and Climate of Hunter, and for them it really was the case that all of a sudden with Tilt, this guy Scott Walker has come back since the 60s, and what the fuck is going on? So, Darin, I want to ask you to give me a little sound description of Tilt.
Well, I guess we would start with Scott Walker's voice. He's got this like it's so weird because at first it sounds as if like if I were trying to sing like an opera voice, you know what I mean? Like trying to pretend to have like this really deep voice or whatever.
Or did you ever see Forgetting Sarah Marshall?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When he does like the like puppet
that
Dracula
thing
opera at the end. I couldn't stop thinking about that at first, but okay, go on.
Yeah, so that that description there I think covers the vocals pretty well. Musically, gone are any simple rhythms and pop anything. All of that is just pretty much eradicated and replaced with there's still strings kind of thrown in throughout the record, but there's a lot of like I guess like what would you call like experimental industrial sounds. Just it sounds as if like that pop music that you were familiar with from if you had listened to the previous record has just been completely torn down, and you're left with an aftermath, and you have much longer songs, much longer, kind of drawn out. I wouldn't really say there's anything in terms of, like quick tempos or anything like that, right? I mean, I don't know. I'm at a loss at how else to describe this record.
Yeah, it's quite minimal, and it's quite empty. A lot of empty space all of a sudden, which is kind of incredible after. The earlier records have this real wall of sound, Phil Spector thing going on, and now it's like he's in love with just like this silence. And there's a lot of like kind of booming, almost like military-esque drum rhythms. A lot of times that's like the single driving force of the song. But it's always like a dull thud. It's not like, big booming drums. It's like sort of eerily muted. And his voice is always up front and center. You've often got like, sometimes there's strings, which we'll talk about, especially like at the beginning, Farmer in the City. But a lot of times it's like stuff that kind of sounds like maybe feedback or like, strange wind instruments and stuff. I was actually looking at the instrument list and, some of the stuff, it's like, who's ever fucking heard of this shit? But, weird, like creaky things. Sometimes there's like stuff that sounds like keys rattling or whatever. I mean, it's almost like industrial post-punk, but like, I don't know. What would you add, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, it's like you've got this voice that's so front and center, like Darin said, and it's just like it's like a haunting, like it's like this ghost has wandered in, like it's this crazy operatic. There's just nobody that has the voice that really sounds like this. And then the backing, it's these weird muted percussion noises, and just it's like very hard to place like what instrument is doing what a lot of times. And then you just sometimes like a sound or an instrument will come in, and it just like, it sounds so like, I don't know, like weirdly like production wise dated. Like sometimes it'll just be like a really like 80s sounding guitar just like kicks in or something, and you're like, what the
Climate
fuck?
of Hunter kind of does a similar thing, even though like it is the 80s, but it sounds like a fretless bass on this record as well. And it's got a very like, it's like dated, but almost like out of time.
No, that's like it makes it so hard to like place like what the fuck is going on, because like just the way he sings sounds like so old.
It sounds like like Leader, right, Darin? Like these sort of operatic songs that like many composers, Mahler, etc., would write.
Right.
But then you sometimes have like these intrusions of like military or tribal drums, and then like 80s fretless bass or something, like just there's I forget which song where there's like whistling and Face on Breast, and the whistling is like extremely harsh and kind of like painful in your ear. And we don't even have to talk about the Cockfighter, which scares the shit out of me every single time.
No, one night I was laying in bed listening to this record, and I like fell asleep quickly during Farmer in the City, and then Cockfighter scared the fucking shit out of me. I for real jumped up, and I woke my wife up.
Yeah.
And that it just comes out of nowhere.
I don't even know what to...
Honey, the Cockfighter.
There's cockfighting.
I don't even know what to call it, because it's just like...
It's like a jump scare.
But it's like white noise, like rhythmically. It's like the strangest, like harshest thing.
Yeah, I don't even know what's making the noise. But before that, like if you listen to it in headphones and like kind of crank it, it's just like this weird, he's like sort of like whisper,
I know,
talking,
and it fucks
singing.
Because you have to turn it up to
because you're like, you're like, what something's going on. Because if you have it at like a reasonable volume, it kind of just sounds like silence, and so you're like, what the fuck did my phone mess up? And so you crank it, and then he blasts you in the ass.
I know. And it's funny too, because then like a Patriot, a single, actually has like silence, I think, at the beginning and the end, but I'm too afraid to like turn it up really loud.
It's gonna get you again.
I'm like, is the song over? It can't be over. It's not over yet.
Yeah. There's a certain element here that feels like you are watching a horror film. But we also, so like Farmer in the City, I kind of want to talk about the lyrics, but they're almost impossible to talk about because it's like so hard to understand what he's talking about. But like Farmer in the City, right, is sort of about this this filmmaker, Pasolini, filmmaker and poet, as it turns out, who was murdered, and it's like sung from his perspective. And this is like the thing that I think I could really feel, like especially in the Brel songs on Scott 2, where it's like this fascination with different perspectives of characters that are twisted really in different ways. Like the soldier on Next, is really a fascinating character study. And so is, Pasolini. It's just that we're really, kind of like removed from it because it's so obscure. Like, do you hear 21? I don't even know what that is. It's like, is there like an auctioning going on or something?
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I didn't know what the fuck that meant because I was thinking like, I was wondering like, does he mean blackjack? But that's like weird to say. Like, do you mean do I see 21 or hear 21? So I looked it up on like Genius, and they said like an auction, but it's just like some Yahoo in the comments.
But also like there's stuff like because he's saying like can't go buy a man from Rio, and when Pasolini died, he actually bought a male prostitute who killed him. Supposedly, people think there was like mafia shit going on, but. So it's like this auction, there's something like, this is what I'm getting at. There's like something swirling around. Like, do I hear 21? I'll give you 21. It's like something like kind of an auction. And then there's this idea of like buying a male prostitute, but then like this background information of he's going to kill you. And then there's like this really, it gets like deeply touching because he's sort of talking to his lover, and it's sort of adapting actually a poem he wrote. And it says like, Paolo, take me with you. It was the journey of a life. It's like the strings are really emotional. It's like the strangest mixture of feelings that these like really fleeting images give me. You know what I mean?
The other you talk about the like can't go buy a man from Rio, can't go buy a man from Vigo. Of course, Genius is in no way official or anything. But like in Genius, they say like can't go buy BY a man from Rio, and then can't go buy BUY a man from Vigo. Like I wonder,
who knows?
Like if that's fucked up or if he meant it. Because
where did they get that information from?
Yeah, because then what the fuck does that mean? Can't go.
Well, I think he's like,
I don't know.
I think. The little description sort of guesses that like he's maybe even playing with the word, and I wouldn't put it past him because there's some like the poetry here is just like it's almost like inscrutable. It's just like it just feels like there's a lot of stuff going on. But another thing I want to mention is that it does feel like there is something going on. Like if I had, it reminds me of reading like James Joyce's Ulysses, right? And again, not trying to name drop show off, but it's like I had to take a whole class that focused on just reading this one book to be able to finish it. And, we were required to buy another book that was longer than Ulysses of just annotations, so you could read it. And I feel like if I had something like that, these lyrics would be incredible because like, Patriot, a single, it's kind of like about a person being tortured. And you get this very stream of consciousness, like Virginia Woolf, James Joyce style, like you're in his head, but he's not like thinking very clearly. And he's like a little delirious, and as the music sort of crescendos when it's like tonight he'll rise, he'll sell his arms to anyone who asks about, it's like I kind of feel like he's like he's being tortured so much that he's kind of like hallucinating or something. He starts to talk in German, which if Genius didn't cite this, I wouldn't know what it is, but it's like a German newspaper, so he's kind of like maybe thinking I'll be a hero in the press at least, at the end there's like just this weird, it just ends with him saying like 17A Ryan New, like I don't know if he's like giving up the code that he's being tortured for at the end and like finally this sweet release or something. You get what I'm saying, Darin? Like it feels like there's something to find here. It would just take a lot of work to get it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that your point about having something to some sort of annotation, I think would be important. I know you mentioned that the lyrics were worth looking at, but honestly, it would take a lot. And I agree that there's probably definitely something there, but I feel like you kind of already have to enjoy listening to this, at least initially, to want to get that far. And I didn't come away wanting to go any deeper, I guess you could say.
Well, let's dive into that. So you did you find anything? Any successes here? Any songs, or just
no
remained impenetrable?
Yeah, no.
Not even thinking of it as like leader or something. You're a big classical music fan.
Yeah. I can appreciate that. And it was certainly interesting, but I just don't know. I just didn't come away after repeated listens, most of which I was kind of like, is it over yet? I haven't gotten there yet. And then, of course, like, Patriot, I'm thinking that it's over, and then it's not over. But, yeah, I don't know. It just, nothing really connected with me, maybe it's just a weird thing to try to listen to this record and, like, Scott 2, like, back to back. Because I guess it's just so easy to think, well, I'll go back to Scott 2. It's fine. Like, just give another spin of Scott 2, and then I'll come back to maybe that was kind of what was happening. But I don't know. I can definitely appreciate the work here, and I like you mentioned, I'm sure putting more work into it would probably reap more, rewards for as a listener. But I couldn't connect.
Well, Dan, I mean, if you can remember, you must have found this challenging. Did it take like a long time to get into it?
I don't want to sound like super patrician guy, but this wasn't the first experimental, thing I ever listened to. So no, it wasn't. In fact, like the first time you put this record on and then you hear these like haunting noises and then, this Do I Hear 21 thing, that like sucks me in. I know like from the get-go of that, I'm like, this is a record that I'm interested in. It's just spooky, like scary, odd. It's like what I want coming into it. But if I wasn't, well versed in odd music, I definitely like, I understand the impenetrability of this record. I've built up enough resistance through other things that it was not super difficult for me. But I don't want to try to act like I'm trying to be cool,
Well, I listened to a ton of experimental stuff, and I still found this pretty hard. And I like enjoy it and have come to like really respect it, but I still wouldn't say that it's easy to listen to. I can sort of feel after, because I really spent like an entire week listening to the, earlier records, and then I plan on spending an entire week like kind of listening to the later records, but I just couldn't actually get past this one, like feel like I got it enough to even try to move on to the drift. So even though I do want to hear that meat punching that I saw in the documentary. But, slowly it feels like things like begin to open themselves up, because I really think that Farmer in the City is like it's just a gorgeous song to me at this point. It's like not even weird to me. It's just like breathtaking. And just the way that it constructs like this, strange rumination on this guy who was really horribly murdered, blows my mind. Patriot, a single I mentioned before, that's kind of like the first time that the strings really like, predominantly come back, and it's like it's so awesome after you've made it through all of that hard work to hear these like absolutely gorgeous strings, and they're so dense, they're so like, a lot of times the orchestration, reminds me of something like, Alban Berg, or, these kind of like atonal opera composers, something like Strauss a little bit. And the way he sings reminds me of Strauss a lot, like Strauss's Salome, where it's like where he is singing in the chord, if you could call it that, is really counterintuitive and odd, like there's which song is it where this kind of like synth thing comes in? Maybe it's Face on Breast as well. It's like there's like this synth line coming in, and he's singing with it, almost creating like, what do they call that? Remember like in the emo world of our youth, like horror chords, where it'd be like something so atonal that it's like sort of pulsating in like weird ways. He's doing that like with his voice and what sounds like, I don't know, maybe like a flute or a harmonica thing or some obscure instrument. This is all like deeply intellectually fascinating, and some things I think are so breathtaking, like lyrically, the way that Rosary ends, is just so haunting. Actually, the whole song just like suddenly being this really discordant, clean electric guitar. It like at some points like plays like what sounds like a real chord, and it's such a like you're like, oh my God, it's about to become a song that I recognize as a song, but then it like goes away immediately. And, it's still, basically what I'm trying to say is it's still hard, but I find it very intellectually stimulating. And I think back about our conversation about Olivia Tremor Control, and sometimes when experimental things are more fun to think about than to listen to, but it sounds like you didn't even get there, Darin.
Well, I mean, if I were to point out moments in the album that I, liked upon repeated listens, definitely Patriot. I know you've been talking about that one quite a bit. I like that song, for me, I feel like it comes late, like I'm like waiting for it to kind of pick up. Cause it feels like a crescendo that the whole album has been like building up to, you know what I mean? Like when that first kind of crashes in. I like the song Tilt as well. And Farmer in the City is a great start to the record, but it, I just immediately start to like get lost by the time you get to like Bouncer, See Bouncer, Manhattan.
That one's particularly hard. Bouncer, See Bouncer.
Yeah. You didn't like in Manhattan, like in the I'll call it a verse, but just loosely. Like when he says like the fleur-de-lis stuff, the like tom drumming, that was like so Tool. It's like the most Tool song.
It kind of is.
I thought you would like that.
There's some stuff that like makes you think a little bit of like 90s alt rock, or Nine Inch Nails or something. But it just makes you think like, God, Trent Reznor should also go full Scott Walker like in his later years. That would be fucking badass. But another thing I would ask you, Darin, is how about if the music isn't doing it for you, how about like the mythology surrounding this record? Because it's frankly pretty incredible. Like the Quietists, their obituary, it sort of makes a nice argument that, like I was saying earlier, that like he's always kind of self-consciously mythologizing even later on, but they're talking about Tilt, and they say it's hard to recall the degree to which it seemed to come out of nowhere. A self-willed dream soundscape drawing on half-remembered Pasolini films, modern classical minimalism, Lieder, the early stirrings of post-rock, and traces of industrial music. It was, of course, exactly the kind of record the mythical Scott would produce on emerging from self-perpetuated exile, and remains a brilliantly executed work of genius. So what I want to ask, I guess, both of you is like, is it even possible like not to hear this record as this like incredible comeback from this very mysterious recluse? Like, doesn't it feel like that outside context stuff is such an important part of this record? Like, what would it even sound like without that? You know what I mean, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I can see that. If you knew nothing of Scott Walker, nothing about him, and somebody played you Tilt, you'd be like, who let this guy, into the recording studio? So I think there is like some importance in the mythology, and I mean, the part of like what is so great about him is this like dramatic change. So without the, if he comes just to this fully formed, I think it's still just as good of a record, but it doesn't have such a great story. And we've talked about in the past, like sometimes what tips a record over, or what really makes something a true classic, is like having a good backstory, or having it arriving at the perfect moment, or just things don't exist in a vacuum, with art. And so I think that this backstory is important and does help, and it is a part of what makes him so great. I mean, isn't it such like a cool like story that like this teen idol and disappears, and he comes back and he makes just the most challenging experimental like record you've ever heard. Like that's probably why I listened to him the first time. I'm sure I read that somewhere and I said, I got to hear that. It's a rad selling point, even though it is like a little not true,
right.
But it's enough true to get you to listen, and get and feel like you got to dig into it.
Yeah, I mean, does that compel you at all? Does that like fascinate you at all, Darin? Even though you don't dig it that much?
It definitely does. I'm a big fan of like lore, mythology surrounding an artist. I'm actually a pretty big fan of artists who take a long time to create records. You know what I mean? Because I just, you like to think that so much could be going on, that like the inception of some of these, or conception of some of these songs may have started like forever ago, and then how they developed over the years, so that when you finally get to the final product, it sounds like, you can hear the amount of like, time, effort, the labor, and when you talk about like an experimental record such as this, you just got to imagine like, wow, like how painstaking was it to put something like this together, that it took so long. Now, my understanding from my reading is that maybe the recording sessions only took like 4 years or something like that. Because I think Wikipedia
really
mentioned that Wikipedia, I think, mentioned that like some of the songs were, recorded or started in like 91, 92 or something like that. Is that true? Or were these really like worked on for longer than that?
Well, it really feels to me like, I mean, can you even imagine what an outtake of this album would be? Like,
right.
It just sounds like completely crafted. And it really feels like, I mean, they talk about this in that documentary, that he's got like a sound in his head where it's like, he's very specifically after something that he's sort of imagined. And I just, it's really incredible to me. He does stuff like, they talk about how he would kind of like hide the melody from the other musicians because he doesn't want anybody to like be swinging, quote, swinging together too well, I don't know. I find his work ethic very mysterious in the sense that it's just like fully arranged in his head. But again, this is all part of his, this kind of like myth around him. At the same time, it does kind of give you this like desire to take it seriously, which I think is really important when something is this challenging. You listen to the Bouncer See Bouncer track, and it's like long stretches of this 9-minute thing are just like a booming tom and his voice, right? And when you kind of know the context and not only did he spend like 10 years on this, but he like emerged from basically complete like hiding, like he doesn't seem to really like to be in the spotlight, and yet he had to put this out. It just makes you think, well, every single Tom hit is there for a reason. So even if I don't get it right now, I'm going to keep listening, and it was important to him, so it's going to be important to me. I appreciate that. You know what I mean, Dan?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a great point. Everything about this record and all of his later stuff, nothing feels like unnecessary. Everything, you even though you might not understand why it's there, you understand that it was in his head, and that's just so cool. Like it doesn't seem like there's much like collaboration going on. It's like he uses other musicians because he doesn't know how to play. Whatever he hears in his head.
Trying to achieve. Yeah, exactly.
He doesn't. He doesn't know how to punch the meat correctly.
Right.
And in fact, when the album with Sun came out, I read an interview with one of the guys in Sun, and they said that he like completely came to them with like demos of what they were supposed to play, and just it's almost like he needed to borrow their 30 million amps is all it was. Like they didn't like write those songs. Scott Walker wrote them, and that's just really interesting, and I think fairly rare in artists and musicians in particular.
Yeah, definitely. We're running out of time here. I think we talked about you talked a little bit about your thoughts about the coming Scott albums after this, which, I still need to listen to, although after a week of listening to Tilt and trying to unlock it for, every day, I'm going to need to take a little breather. I want to kind of wrap up by just trying to, figure out, what did we learn? Like, why does Scott Walker have this like deep obsessive cult following? Is it just like pure, this kind of like brave, like just adventurousness, this uncompromising thing?
I think the braveness, the uncompromising, and I think another big thing is like so many, well-respected artists that are easier, have given him the cosign. I mean, Bowie loved him.
Yeah,
you can hear Black Star. Black Star is, and I love that record, but it's a watered down version of late Scott Walker. It's a more palatable version of what Walker does, and I mean, things like that. I mean, it just makes it like where you feel the need. A lot of like challenging things people can easily dismiss as like just dicking around or unnecessarily odd or something. But like with Walker, it's like it's all for a reason, and I think it like lends you to want to dig into it.
Yeah. Have you ever listened to Portishead's Third?
Yeah.
That is so Tilt to me now. I never knew where the fuck that was coming from. Like the just strange transformation that they make.
Yeah.
But they did it. They pulled a tilt. And we got to get more artists to pull tilts because it's so exciting to just hear this artist you love just completely reinvent themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah. What about you, Darin? I mean, it sounds like if our central question was to figure out what does it take to get into Scott Walker, you didn't figure it out. We're gonna have to do it again next week and cover the rest of it.
I think the proper approach might be to just focus on one end or the other. You know what I mean? I think it is difficult to just take two records, one from the early era and one from the later era, and try to consume them both. You know what I mean? I'm sure if I spent more time with Tilt, maybe explored the other records as well, that I'd find maybe a deeper appreciation. All this talk about, the story, the mythology, it's gotten me sort of amped to want to actually give it another listen. You know what I mean? Because I truly do appreciate artists who spend a lot of time on the craft, you know what I mean? And I think there is something very compelling about taking 10 years between records, when you could so easily just throw something out 2 years, every 2 years or something like that. You know what I mean? Like you could, certainly Scott Walker had the material or the ability to do that, but he didn't think it was right, or whatever sound he was chasing after just wasn't ready yet. You know what I mean? So that kind of stuff takes time. And I think as a listener, we definitely owe it to the artist to truly give it a fair shot and not just dismiss it after a week or two of listening. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I personally, as a musician, we've all made music. I found it very inspiring because, first off, it's very uncompromising. Obviously, this really brave experimental spirit, but also, there were so many things on this record, and actually also the early records, where it's I just really instinctively did not like them at first, the sound in the Cockfighter or something like that. That 80s kind of sounding fretless bass thing strikes me as not a sound I like. I actually hate industrial music for some reason. I don't know why, but and it sort of terrified me because I realized when I make music, I frequently, actually always, make a sound and I decide if I like that sound. In 1 second, I decide if I like that sound. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And if I don't, I change it. And if I do, I start building on that sound, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's just the idea that this dude is spending 10 years, to really make sure if it's the right sound, even if it doesn't sound right the first, 45 times to him or something, then he starts to get it. I was almost oh my God, what? I could never even dream of writing like that, but it is inspiring. It's, I don't know. I understand why people are obsessed with them, and I do hear his influence, honestly, all over the place. I mentioned Portishead, but stuff like Laurie Anderson, or really just Swans is obvious one. Just the experimental spirit is just sort of flowing through this thing. So, I would consider myself having been converted to a fan. I would say that you succeeded, Dan.
Good.
Darin, it sounds like he half succeeded with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly going to check out the other Scott records. I definitely would say I'm a Scott Walker fan of the early era. Get back with me on the other half. I'll let you know.
All right, well, I think that's enough for this week. So what do you think? We'd love to read your thoughts on air. You can email us popshieldpod@gmail.com. Our next episode will be in 2 weeks. Not sure yet. Maybe another Scott Walker record. Probably not. Probably not. If you like the show, help us out. Subscribe. Leave us a 5-star rate and review wherever you can. Stay connected. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that junk. It's at PopShieldPod, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
See ya.
So long.